I thought installing a doorbell camera would protect my marriage. I never imagined it would introduce me to the woman who would change my life. I'm not proud of how my marriage ended, but if I'm going to tell this story, I have to start there. I was 23, working long days installing home security systems across the city. Most jobs blurred together: drills, wires, polite smiles, invoices. Then one rainy Tuesday, I was sent to replace a faulty doorbell camera at an older house tucked beneath towering maple trees. She opened the door before I could knock. She looked to be in her mid-40s, dressed simply in a light sweater and jeans, with silver beginning to thread through her dark hair. There was nothing dramatic about her, yet I forgot the greeting I'd rehearsed in the truck. "You must be the technician," she said with a tired smile. I nodded a little too quickly. "Daniel." "Claire." The house was unusually quiet. A mug of coffee sat untouched on the kitchen counter, already cold. Family photographs had been turned face down on a bookshelf, as though someone couldn't bear to look at them anymore. While I installed the new camera, she lingered nearby, pretending to organize mail that never seemed to get sorted. "So," she said after a long silence, "do these things really catch the truth?" I laughed softly. "They only record what stands in front of them." She looked toward the front door instead of at me. "Sometimes," she whispered, "that's exactly the problem." When I finished, our hands brushed as I returned her keys. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Then the new doorbell camera chimed. Someone was standing outside. Claire's face lost every trace of color. She looked at the screen, and quietly said, "He found me." For a second, neither of us moved. The man outside stared into the new doorbell camera as if he already knew she was watching. His jaw was tight, one hand shoved into his coat pocket while the other rested on the porch railing. Claire muted the speaker before I could hear him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You walked into something you shouldn't have." I should have packed my tools, wished her luck, and left. Instead, I asked, "Do you want me to call someone?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. "He was my husband." The sentence landed heavier than I expected. "We're separated," she continued, rubbing her thumb against the edge of the kitchen counter. "He keeps saying he just wants to talk. Every time I believe him, we end up hurting each other again." The room fell silent except for the rain tapping softly against the windows. I found myself noticing things I shouldn't have. The way she kept tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear whenever she was nervous. The tiny crack in her favorite coffee mug, repaired carefully instead of thrown away. The wedding ring that was no longer on her finger, leaving only a pale mark behind. She looked like someone who had spent months pretending she was stronger than she felt. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to make the house feel safe again. The doorbell chimed once more. This time, the porch was empty. Her husband had already driven away. Claire let out a slow breath, almost embarrassed that I'd witnessed any of it. "You probably have another appointment," she said. "I do." Neither of us moved toward the door. Then she stepped closer, lightly resting her fingers on my forearm. "Daniel." she whispered, avoiding my eyes. Would you stay just a little longer? I don't want to be alone right now. For the first time that afternoon, I forgot I was only there to install a camera. Part 3, Heightening Suspense. I'll make some fresh coffee, Claire said, almost apologetically. The last one. I forgot it was there. I nodded, grateful for something ordinary to focus on. While she moved around the kitchen, I pretended to check the settings on the new doorbell camera, even though I'd already finished. The house was warm now, filled with the quiet hiss of the kettle and the rain easing against the windows. You don't have to stay because you feel sorry for me, she said without turning around. I know. Then why are you still here? I searched for an answer that sounded professional. I guess. I wanted to make sure you were okay. She smiled faintly. That's not a technician's job. No, I admitted. It isn't. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She handed me a mug, but as I reached for it, our fingers touched. Neither of us had meant for it to happen, yet neither of us moved immediately. It lasted only a heartbeat before we both looked away. Claire wrapped both hands around her own cup. I used to think this house felt too big, she said quietly. Now it feels too empty. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to face that silence alone. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee that had become far too hot to taste. Just then, my phone rang. My supervisor. I watched the screen light up with another reminder that I was already late for my next appointment. You should answer, Claire said. I should. The phone stopped ringing. A second later, someone knocked firmly on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Claire's shoulders stiffened. She looked at me, then toward the entrance. I wasn't expecting anyone. The knocking came again. This time, whoever was outside called her name. And without thinking, I stepped between Claire and the door. The knocking didn't stop. I looked through the peephole before unlocking anything. A man in his late 40s stood on the porch, soaked from the rain. His shoulders sagged, and whatever anger had brought him there seemed to have drained away. Claire, he called again. Please. Just hear me out. She closed her eyes. I can't keep doing this. I turned back to her. You don't have to answer. She nodded, but her hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the kitchen counter. He wasn't always like this, she whispered. Somewhere along the way, we stopped talking, and started keeping score. Every conversation became another reason to leave. The words weren't really meant for me. They were something she'd been carrying for far too long. Outside, the knocking faded. Then footsteps retreated down the porch. Neither of us moved until the sound of a car engine disappeared into the distance. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain. I should go, I said, though the words came out weaker than I intended. Claire looked at me for a long moment. Is that what you want? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because the truth scared me. I'd known this woman for less than an afternoon, yet leaving suddenly felt harder than staying. It wasn't just the kindness in her voice or the sadness she tried so hard to hide. It was the way she made every ordinary moment feel honest. She took one careful step closer. "I don't want you to stay because I need rescuing," she said softly. "I've spent too much of my life waiting for someone to rescue me." Her eyes met mine. "I just don't want to pretend I wasn't relieved when you knocked on my door today." My heartbeat thundered in the quiet room. I swallowed hard. "Claire." She didn't look away. Instead, she asked the one question neither of us was ready to answer. "What happens if this isn't just a coincidence?" Claire's question hung between us. Neither of us answered. My phone vibrated again, breaking the silence. It wasn't my supervisor this time, it was my older sister, Emma. "I've been trying to reach you," she said as soon as I answered. "Did you finish the camera installation for Claire Bennett?" I glanced toward Claire. "Yeah, why?" There was a pause. "You don't remember her, do you?" "I've never met her." "You have." The words stopped me cold. "When Dad was in the hospital after the accident 6 years ago," Emma continued, "there was a volunteer who came every evening after work. She'd sit with him when Mom needed to go home. She'd read to him, bring him coffee, make sure he wasn't alone." A memory surfaced, blurred at first. A woman's quiet voice drifting through a hospital room. The scent of coffee. Someone adjusting a blanket over my sleeping father. "I was away at college," I whispered. "You saw her once," Emma said. "You thanked her before you left. She probably doesn't even remember." I ended the call slowly. Claire watched my expression change. "What is it?" I took a careful breath. "Were you a hospital volunteer, 6 years ago?" Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "I was." "You stayed with my father." For a moment, she simply stared. Then recognition softened her face. "The young man with the backpack," she said quietly. "You were always rushing to catch the last train." I laughed once, unable to believe it. "You remember." "I remember because your father kept talking about how proud he was of you." The room fell silent again. All afternoon I had believed I'd walked into a stranger's home by chance. Now it felt as though life had been quietly crossing our paths long before either of us noticed. Claire stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, maybe today wasn't the beginning after all." Neither of us spoke for what felt like a full minute. The rain had finally stopped. Through the front window, the clouds were beginning to break, and for the first time that afternoon, sunlight reached the porch where her husband had been standing only an hour before. Claire was the first to break the silence. "I think I spent too many years believing that if I just tried harder, my marriage would become what it used to be." She looked down at her hands. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that two people have to choose each other." I nodded slowly. "My divorce isn't final," she continued. "Legally, there's still paperwork left." I met her eyes. "I know. And I won't start something new before I've finished what needs to end." There was no hesitation in her voice. It wasn't rejection. It was respect, for herself, and for whatever this was becoming. I smiled, even though part of me wished time would move faster. I'd wait. The words surprised both of us. Claire searched my face as though trying to decide whether I'd regret saying them. You barely know me. I know enough. I knew she repaired cracked coffee mugs instead of throwing them away. I knew she still believed in kindness after everything she'd been through. I knew she'd spent years carrying more loneliness than anyone should. And I knew I didn't want to be another person who disappeared from her life. A tear slipped down her cheek before she brushed it away with an embarrassed laugh. You make terrible timing sound romantic. I'm a security technician, I said with a grin. Timing has never been my strength. She laughed, a real laugh this time. Then she reached for my hand. No hesitation. No fear. Just a quiet promise held between our fingers. When everything is finally over, she whispered, come back and knock on my door. I squeezed her hand gently. I promise. For the first time that day, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt like something worth waiting for. A year passed before I knocked on Claire's door again. This time, I wasn't carrying a toolbox. I was carrying flowers. She opened the door almost immediately, and before either of us spoke, we both smiled the way people do when they've spent months imagining the same moment. It's official, she said softly. It's over. The divorce had been finalized weeks earlier. She hadn't called right away. She wanted to make sure she wasn't stepping into a new chapter simply because she was escaping the old one. She wanted to choose it. She wanted to choose me. She reached for my hand, and this time there was nothing unfinished standing between us. No marriage to untangle. No guilt. No uncertainty. Only two people who had met at the wrong moment, but refused to become the wrong story. Months later, the old doorbell camera sent a notification to Claire's phone. Someone was standing on the porch. She opened the app and smiled. It was me, carrying groceries after work because she'd texted that she'd forgotten to shop. She opened the front door before I could ring the bell. I guess the camera still tells the truth, I teased. She slipped her hand into mine. It does. What does it see? She looked up at me with the same quiet certainty that had replaced the sadness in her eyes. It sees someone coming home. Looking back, I realized that the camera never destroyed my marriage. It simply recorded the day my old life ended, and the day my real one quietly began. Sometimes life closes one door so another can finally be opened by the right person at exactly the right time. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next? ****